Greetings to all. On behalf of Earthkeeper and James Tiburon, we warmly welcome each of you to Earthkeeper 2020 videos. The following wonderful video presentation was filmed live at the epic Earthkeeper Arklantis conference in November of 2019 in Sacred, Arkansas, the Crystal Vortex. Earthkeeper are honored to present Kevin Todeschi. Kevin is a kind and wise master soul of great kindness, wisdom, humility and dedication. He is a prolific author and superb speaker with a wonderful sense of humor. Kevin is recognized globally as a master teacher, and in this video he speaks on a truly fascinating topic. On matters of great interest to seekers, the subject is angels, guides and the afterlife. Kevin's information is based on the Edgar Cayce readings, and Kevin Todeschi is unquestionably a well-studied, brilliant translator, and keenly insightful interpreter of the sometimes nebulous Edgar Cayce readings, translating the many books he writes into clear, articulate, easy-to-understand information. Indeed, his over 60 books contain Edgar Cayce teachings, important information, which is very applicable in today's world, and especially in present times. Spiritually valuable teachings. Earthkeeper's 2019 Epic Arklantis 4-day event was held November 22nd through 25th in the beautiful crystalline Ozark Mountain Valley of Sacred, Arkansas, the Crystal Vortex. On behalf of Earthkeeper and James and Ann Tiburon, we thank you from our hearts. Namaste. Enjoy. Kevin will begin on angels and the afterlife, angels, guides and the afterlife, after this brief musical opening. Please stay tuned. You don't want to miss this excellent presentation and spirit-filled teaching from a gentle and wise walking master. Stay tuned.
moments before I introduce our next speaker, and you don't want to miss this next presentation. But while I have this time, I want to again encourage you to become a member of the Edgar Cayce Association of Research and Enlightenment. It's a minimal charge. It'll cost you less than it would take for a family of four to go to McDonald's. So just put it in perspective. And it is just an amazing organization. And it is time now for the spiritual seekers in the world to be part of an organization. You have a very, very powerful organization, a credible organization that is very well managed. How many of you here are interested in joining the ARE? Please raise your hand. Okay. Well, we want you to join. We encourage you, and it's a minimal charge. I was sitting on the banks of the Amazon River in 1978 when a German man gave me a copy of There Is a River, and that changed my life and continues to change my life. I think the ARE is the most credible spiritual organization on the planet. You can get into all sorts of metaphysical studies, but it is always the work of Edgar Cayce that brings me back to spirituality. There is the science of metaphysics, and then there is the full circle. And it is the Edgar Cayce group that does that. So I would like to introduce to you a man who I hold in great esteem. He has done a tremendous job as Chief Executive Officer of Edgar Cayce's ARE. And he has written over 60 books, I believe, and just a wonderful, wonderful man. How many of you have not been to Virginia Beach? You really should make a pilgrimage to the ARE. There is a 600-pound crystal there as well, and a 95-pound lapis lazuli. It is a wonderful organization. At this point, I'd like to introduce Kevin Todeschi.
Thanks, Tib. Thanks for having John and I here. This is such a great conference to go to. John and I have lots of opportunities to go to places, and this is one of our favorites. So I've been asked to talk to you a little bit about angels, guides, and the afterlife. And I think some of the things I'm going to say tonight might be a little new, stretch your mind a little bit. So I ask you to suspend judgment and disbelief, because even some people in ARE, I don't think, truly understand everything Edgar Cayce had to say about angels, guides, and the afterlife. And because we're talking about the afterlife, I want to start with a funny story. This is a story about a couple who were in their 90s. They had been together for 65 years, and they were in great shape. The wife had insisted on exercise and diet all their years together. And unfortunately, they passed away in a car accident that wasn't their fault. So they get up to heaven, the pearly gates, and they're met by St. Peter, and he takes them to their new abode, which is a beautiful mansion with a full stock kitchen and a maid. And the husband looks at St. Peter. He says, "What's this going to set me back?" And St. Peter says, "Nothing. It's your reward. You're in heaven. There's no charge." The guy's pretty impressed. He's walking around the house. He looks out this big giant window and sees a gorgeous golf course across the street. He says, "What are the greens fees on that course?" And St. Peter says, "I'll take you over there." He says, "There is no fee. This is heaven. It's your reward." And they get over the golf course, and he realizes there's 3 greens over there and no fee. And he sees this beautiful buffet laid out in front of him. And he looks at St. Peter, and St. Peter says again, "No charge." And the guy says, "Well, what about cholesterol?" He said, "You don't have to worry about it. You're in heaven." He said, "What about overweight?" "You don't have to worry about it. You're in heaven." He turns to his wife and says, "You and your damn bran muffins, we could have been here 10 years ago." So the idea is that the afterlife is probably a lot better than we're thinking. So Tib talked a lot about ARE and some of the things you can do. You know, lots of times people don't realize that there's an online portion of ARE's membership where there's a wealth of resources and materials you can look at. You can actually go to that online resource and you could watch John and I age over the last 30 years. So it is a tremendous resource. Here's some of the things that as a member you can take advantage of in terms of angels, archangels, and the afterlife. Old lectures, old materials. So if you're interested in some of the topics I'm talking about tonight and you're a member, you can go online and look up more information for yourself. So we're going to start out and we're going to talk about angels. And my goal tonight is to talk to you about angels, guides, and the afterlife, to talk to you a little bit about what Edgar Cayce said, and to tell you any personal experiences I might have had along the way. My mic sounds like it's going in and out. Are you guys can hear me okay? Okay. So let's start with angels. And for a little humor, let's start out with a slide I found that I kind of like. There's two little guys here in Santa's workshop. One says to the other, "Oh, I definitely believe in angels. It's elves I have a hard time with." So, and that's what we're talking about tonight. So in terms of angels, what did Edgar Cayce have to say? He said a number of things. One, he says each and every one of us have a guardian angel that stays with us at all times. He also suggested that when we're involved in a particular work, or we're involved in a certain period of our lives, or we have a project, such as child rearing, that all those very often involve the angelic realms, helping us in ways that we probably couldn't even imagine. We also have angels that stay with us if we have projects that carry over into other lives. On one occasion, he told a woman that the same angel had been with her for over 2,000 years, working on the same project. Probably they think we should get on with it a little quicker, but in any event, we have angels that stay with us. But more than anything else, what Cayce suggested about angels is really reflected in 3 places in the Bible. And in Cayce's wording, it was this: "He has given his angels charge concerning thee, that thou dash not thy foot against a stone." And that same concept is really shown in Matthew, in Luke, and then Psalms. And the idea is that one job of the angelic realms is to help each and every one of us with our own soul growth and development. And when times get rough, the angelic realms are there. When we don't think we can bear it on anymore, the angelic realms are there. So somehow we are surrounded by angels. We just don't know that that's what's happening all the time. Now I have to tell you that the only personal experience I've ever had with an angel was in a dream. And in my dream, this happened years ago when I was in a Search for God study group, and in the dream I was talking to my guardian angel, and I knew it was my guardian angel. And I remember in the dream looking at this angel, and the angel was gorgeous, and I remember in the dream I couldn't figure out if it was a boy or a girl. I don't know why I was having that thought, but I could not figure out if this was a boy or a girl angel. I just remembered the angel was gorgeous. And the angel was telling me that things were being put in place already for my next incarnation. And the idea was that next time around, I would be much better at being able to manifest both the best of intellect and the best of emotions at the same time. And the angels told me that right now I seem to do either or. Either I was emotional or I was intellectual, but they were not always together. And next time, they were going to have a better balance. And I remember looking at the angel and I said, "Okay, I will agree to that as long as," and I started to give this, kind of a qualifier, and the angel looked at me like, "You've got to be kidding. We're not making a deal here. I'm telling you what's being set in place." And then I woke up. That's all I remember. But that was my first experience, my only experience. Now, some of you have probably heard of Edgar Cayce saw angels, and probably some of you have read There Is a River, which talks about his early experience with angels. Cayce's experience is a little different than that recounted in the book There Is a River. Here's how Edgar Cayce described it when he was a little boy. "A glorious light, as of the rising morning sun, seemed to fill the whole room. And a figure appeared at the foot of my bed. I was sure it was my mother, and I called to her, but she didn't answer. For the moment I was frightened, climbed out of bed, and went into my mother's room. No, she hadn't called. Almost immediately after I returned to my couch, the figure came again. Then it seemed all gloriously bright, an angel or what, I knew not. But gently, patiently, it said, 'Thy prayers are heard. You will have your wish. Remain faithful. Be true to yourself. Help the sick. Help the afflicted. Now, after that experience, Edgar Cayce could sleep on his school books and memorize their content. I'm sure many of you have heard that he could sleep on a book, his father could call out a page in the book, and he could give a verbatim description of what was on that page, even though he may never have actually seen the page. I have tried that, sleeping on a book, and only gotten a pain in the neck. I have had no psychic experience with that. But somehow, this awakened in him an experience with his first real psychic experience. And then he also had other experiences. He said he could see fairies and divas and different things. And on one occasion, a woman who remembered having seen little fairies among the trees and the bushes when she was growing up, heard that Edgar Cayce had done the same thing. And so she asked him to describe what he had seen. And this is a portion of the letter that he sent to her. This is from his recollection when he was a little boy. I looked out the window from the house and saw the fairies there beckoning me to come and play. That time also my mother saw them very plainly, but she didn't make any objection to my going out to play with them. This experience, as I remember now, lasted during a whole season or summer. He had a young friend, we built a beautiful bower of hazelnut, branches, redwood, dogwood, and the like, where I met my friends to talk with, the little elves of the trees. How often this came, I don't know. We lived there for several years. It was there that I read the Bible through for the first time, that I learned to pray, that I had many visions or experiences, not only of visioning the elves, but what seemed to me to be the hosts that must have appeared to the people of old, as recorded in Genesis. Particularly, in this little bower, there was never any intrusion from those outside. To describe these elves of the trees, the fairies of the woods, or to me the angels or hosts, with all their beautiful and glorious surroundings, would be almost a sacrilege. They have meant and do yet mean so much to me that they are rather the sacred experiences. Now, throughout his life, he had other experiences with angels. Some of you may have heard that when he was a grown man, he was out in his garden, and all at once he heard the sound of thunder, and he looked up in the sky, and he described what he saw, which was an angel with a countenance of light, armor as silver or aluminum, and the angel said, "The chariot of the Lord and the horsemen thereof." And Edgar Cayce all at once realized he was having a vision of World War II, of what was about to happen. Interestingly enough, it suggests that angels are over countries. And Edgar Cayce actually, I'll tell you more in a minute, but he talked about a woman named Flower Newhouse, who said, in fact, every country has its own angel. So in addition to having his own experiences, another thing that Cayce talked about was he had this ability for retrocognition, which is the ability to see into the past. And very often when he'd be giving a past life reading to someone or talking about past history, he would give an overview of stories that many of us know, sometimes biblical stories, and he would give additional details to stories that are in the Bible. So I picked out a couple of them having to do with angels. Now, you've probably all heard in the Bible the story of how the angel Gabriel came to Mary and told her that she was to conceive a child. And she said, "How is this possible? I don't know a man." And, she was basically told that the universal forces was going to send Jesus through her. That's the story. Well, Cayce said it was a little more complicated than that. In fact, he suggested in about 100 different readings that there was a Jewish sect called the Essenes who prepared for 300 years to somehow bring a great soul into the earth. And they decided in order to do that, they had to be as pure a human vessel as possible. And so 300 years, they had different people go through purification techniques. They prepared a group of young women over and over again that they might be used to be channels. And then eventually, one day, this is how Cayce described in a couple of readings of what really happened to the story that you read in the Bible about Gabriel visiting. As has been outlined from here in the readings, there were those special groups of individuals who had made some preparations for the expected activities that were to come during that particular period, especially of the Essenes, who had chosen the 12 maidens to indicate their fitness. At the temple were those who were consecrated worship, or a school, Mount Carmel, as it might be termed, for those who might be channels. On this day, as they, the 12 maidens, mounted the steps, all were bathed in the morning sun, which not only made a beautiful picture, but clothed all as in purple and gold. As Mary reached the top step then, there was the thunder and lightning, and the angel Gabriel led the way, taking the child by the hand before the altar. This was the manner of choice. This was the showing of the way. So in other words, Gabriel appeared to the whole community, and the whole community knew somehow that Mary was to be the one. Just one more tell. Many of you are aware of the story in Luke, that when Jesus was born, according to Scripture, some of the shepherds could hear the angelic song. This is how Cayce described it. The shepherds were gathering their flocks into the fold when the herald angels sang. The star appeared that made the wonderment to the shepherds, that caused the awe and consternation. All were in awe as the brightness of his star appeared and shone as the music of the spheres, that joyful choir, peace on earth, goodwill to men of good faith. Who heard these? Who heard the angels, my children? Those that were seeking for the satisfying of their own desires or for the laudation of their own personality? Rather, those close to nature, to the hours of meditation and prayer. Only then could there be heard the song of the angels or the music of the spheres as saying, peace on earth, goodwill to men. Now, interestingly enough, on a number of occasions, Edgar Cayce said that every time a child is born, the angels sing. Because divinity has the opportunity, once again, to be made manifest in the earth. And I had read that over and over and over again, that every time a child's born, the angels sing. So when I had the opportunity, I asked a woman who had had 40 years working with obstetrics, Gladys McGarry, that of all the hundreds of babies she had delivered, had she ever heard the angels sing? And she paused for a moment and looked at me and she said, yes, many times. So again, Cayce suggests every time a child is born, the angels sing. Now, I briefly mentioned Flower Newhouse. Flower Newhouse was a contemporary of Cayce for a while. In fact, people who had readings from Mr. Cayce asked questions about Flower, and he told her that she was a great channel for the angelic realms. Flower suggested that we all have guardian angels, that angels are involved in all levels of creations, that there's levels to the angelic realms, like angels are maybe on their own pathway of development, and that angels guard over continents and countries. In fact, she suggested that the angel of the United States soars 30 feet above the Lincoln Memorial. Now, interestingly enough, Flower had an organization that still is in existence. It's in San Diego. It's called Quest Haven Retreat Center. She passed away in the 90s, but her organization is still in effect, and she wrote a number of books about angels that are in the Airy Library. You can also buy them from them. But Miss Newhouse suggested there was an ongoing involvement of the angelic realms in our life here on earth, just like Edgar Cayce said. Now, I want to talk briefly, this is the part that's going to be a mind stretcher for some, about this idea of fallen angels, and what some people might believe is fallen angels or the devil or evil. Now, let me suggest that this is going to be a mind blower, because what we all think is probably not what is contained in the Edgar Cayce material. So as background, let me suggest that many religious movements are really the religion of monotheism, that there's one God. And we hear it in the Old Testament with this verse, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord, and thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, and all thy soul, and all thy might." And we hear it in the New Testament, in this one. "And Jesus answered him, the first of all the commandments is, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord, and thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, and with all thy soul, and with all thy mind, and with all thy strength." This is the first commandment. And in Islam, this is how they say it. "That is Allah, your Lord. There is no deity except him, the creator of all things. So worship him, and he is the disposer of all things." Now, in spite of the fact that much of the world is interested in monotheism, much of Christianity especially promotes a religion of dualism. And let me explain that. These are all evidence of dualism. This is a real billboard in the South. It says, "Go to church or the devil will get you." This is a screensaver you can download to your computer where you can see the devil and Jesus fighting over your soul. And this is Homer Simpson with an angel on one shoulder and a devil on the other. And every time I see this picture, it reminds me, some of you are old enough to remember Flip Wilson when he played Ernestine, and he'd say, "The devil made me buy that dress." Remember that? So in a variety of ways, we have basically set up this idea that there's good and evil, and they're both vying for us. And they're equal and opposing forces. That's dualism. That's not monotheism. So how could we understand evil? This is the mind stretcher for us. 1, good and evil are equal and opposing realities. And unfortunately, that's what much of Christian thought actually believes. The next one is actually kind of a New Age perspective. Deny the existence of evil, suggesting it is only a misperception created by our lower state of awareness. Lots of people in New Thought have that perception. There's not really evil, it's just our perception. And then there's another alternative, and this is really the alternative in the Edgar Cayce readings. Affirm its reality, but assume that it is somehow contained within the ultimate reality of one God. So somehow there's evil, but somehow that evil is a part of the oneness of God. So let me explain how that works. Cayce suggests that there's several things going on. 1, our job is to bring spirit into the earth. That all of us, our job is to somehow bring divinity into the earth. I've told the ARE staff over and over again, we are all employees for God. And when I say that, I don't just mean employees at ARE. I mean everybody in the world is an employee for God. And everybody in the world, their job is to somehow bring divinity into the earth. The challenge is, most of us don't know that we were hired for that job. And even those that do know, most of those are only working part-time. But our job is to somehow bring divinity into the earth. That's one thing we got going on. Somehow bring spirit into the third dimension. Lots of times people in ARE will tell me, I think this is my last lifetime. Or I hope this is my last lifetime. That's not the perspective in the Cayce material. We have to keep coming here until somehow we have transformed the earth. Bring divinity into the earth. And this other slide is really, we're going to talk about this in just a minute, but this is really a slide of what Edgar Cayce saw, bless you, when he traveled through the different levels of consciousness. And what he saw essentially was very dark, dense forms here at the lower end, and they became lighter and more human-looking, and eventually he rose to higher levels of awareness. The idea being that there are different levels of awareness on the other side, and basically those correspond to our own growth and development. And it's for that reason that one reading suggests, how far then is ungodliness from godliness? Just under. Meaning that as we rise in consciousness, all this dense, dark, perhaps even evil things are no longer a part of our conscious nature. Now let me take it a step further. Because I live in Virginia, I've had the opportunity to speak to lots of conservative churches, and I cannot tell you how many people are convinced that the book of Revelations is about the Antichrist. And let me tell you something that most people are really surprised to hear. The word Antichrist is not in the book of Revelations. It is nowhere in the book of Revelations. The word Antichrist is only in the epistles of John, and it's used in a sentence that basically suggests that those who don't believe Jesus is the Messiah are Antichrist. They don't think he's the Christ. It's not some big dark nemesis. So what is the book of Revelations really about? From Cayce's perspective, it's about John's experience on the Isle of Patmos as his lower self was at war with his higher self as to who's going to win supreme. And Cayce suggested that that experience is an archetypal experience for each and every one of us. Our higher self is constantly at war with our lower self. I'm on a diet, but I really want to eat that chocolate. I want to get along with my spouse, but this mean thing I want to say is so good, I've got to say it anyway. So we have this constant war within ourselves, and we're trying to become a better person. There was a prayer group that studied the book of Revelations for 13 years. Both John and I have written about this, and it's honestly one of the least explored sets of material in the Cayce material, the Revelations material, because people think it's so complicated. It's just a very intense dream. But Cayce suggested this is about John's experience. For the visions, the experiences, the names, the churches, the places, the dragons, the cities, and keep in mind there's 7 of most of these, all corresponding with the 7 centers of the body, are all but emblems of those forces that war within the individual in its journey in the glory or in the awakening in spirit. In other words, it's our own experience as we grow in consciousness. On one occasion, Morton Blumenthal, who had more readings than anybody else, most people had 1 or 2 readings. Morton Blumenthal had 468 readings in 6.5 years. He gets the record. On one occasion, he asked this very interesting question. He asked for, quote, the fundamental principle of all religion and all science. And this was Cayce's answer. The first lesson for 6 months should be 1. 1, 1, 1. Oneness of God. Oneness of man's relation. Oneness of force. Oneness of time. Oneness of purpose. Oneness in every effort, oneness, oneness. Now, what I'm about to say is going to be a stretch for some of us, but what this is saying is that in all of creation, there is only God. Nothing exists but God. Nothing. And we're all a part of that. And Cayce went on to suggest that, remember, the angels are given charge to make sure we don't dash our foot against a stone. Cayce suggested as soon as some of us started choosing things that were out of accord with divine will, a group of angels said, you know what? We will usher in this rebellious nature of humankind so that they only get into so much trouble. And a group of angels followed after the fallen humans to make sure they only got into so much trouble. So in other words, the fallen angels are really those angels who came to help us. There's not this horrendous overview of evil angels on the other side who are out to get us. Because everything is a part of God. Now, on a couple of occasions, a couple of angels spoke through Edgar Cayce. I pulled this. This is actually a group of cards you can buy off Amazon. Why anyone would want karmic angel cards, I mean, just think about that. Karmic angel cards to get guidance from, I don't know, but this is off of Amazon. On one occasion, actually for over a year, there was an angel who spoke through Edgar Cayce. And the first time it occurred was when Edgar Cayce was talking about the fact how it was possible to grow in awareness when we experience suffering. Let me repeat that. That sometimes when we experience suffering, it's possible to grow in awareness. And his next sentence was this: even Jesus learned he obedience through the things that he suffered. Now what that essentially means is that when we get out of tune with spirit, sometimes we experience all kinds of suffering. And when we get back in attunement, we realize, wait, my suffering is less because I'm back in of the flow of things. So it suggests that when we get out of alignment, sometimes we suffer. When we get back in, it's easier to go with the flow. So Cayce was talking about how sometimes when we suffer, we grow in awareness. And all at once, a voice that spoke through Edgar Cayce got excited about this idea of suffering and said, come, my children. You no doubt have gained from the comment this day a new initiate has spoken in or through this channel, Hallel. In other words, this is a channel named Hallel who's really excited about the idea of suffering. And Hallel started showing up on occasion and would announce himself that he was Hallel. So someone asked him on one occasion, who identify yourself? And he said, one who has made the ways that have been heavy, but as the means for understanding. So Hallel was the angel of karma. And the angel of karma suggested that he could help them learn the study group material easier than they'd been doing it. That he'd help them. And some of the members of the first group got excited. You know, this angel wants to work with us. And some of the other people said, are you friggin' kidding? This is the angel of karma. Do you really want to work with this guy, angel of karma? So they had this ongoing debate. Now, so keep three things in mind. This is the angel of karma. He's really interested in suffering, and these two things are very important for what I'm about to tell you. In January 1934, Edgar Cayce was very ill. He was recovering from a cough and a cold and pneumonia. He'd gone to New York to give some readings, and while he was there, a young man who had no connection to the government, to the security, to the safety of the country, to anything, asked for a reading on earth changes. And his question, it was 1934, and his question was, what changes can we expect this year, 1934? Now, I have to say that ARE has actually published this reading over the years, but we left out the question. So no one ever saw the question that says, what angel? I put it back in here. Here it is. What are the changes to come this year physically? 1934, and Cayce says, the earth will be broken up in many places. The early portion will see a change in the physical aspect of the west coast of America. There will be open waters appear in the northern portions of Greenland. There will be new land seen off the Caribbean Sea. South America shall be shaken from the uppermost portion to the end. As to the changes physical again, the earth will be broken up in the western portion of America. The greater portion of Japan must go into the sea. The upper portion of Europe will be changed as in the twinkling of an eye. Land will appear off the east coast of America. There will be upheavals in the Arctic and the Antarctic that will make for the eruption of volcanoes in the torrid areas. And there will be a shifting of the poles, so that where there has been those of a frigid or semi-tropical will become the more tropical, and moss and fern will grow, and these will begin in those periods in 58 to 98. And in between those two statements, this came. I, Hallel, have spoken. Now, this suggests to me, this is not Edgar Cayce. This is the angel of karma talking about the potentials that could happen to this country. This is not an earth change reading from Edgar Cayce again. It's from an archangel that really is the angel of karma. So that was the archangel. The study group decided, we could get better information than an archangel of karma. Eventually Hallel quit showing up. Now, a more benevolent angel showed up in 1928, and he would show up over and over again about a dozen times for the rest of Edgar Cayce's life. And he showed up on one occasion when Edgar Cayce was asked, really, what should be the purpose of the work? And the answer was that we make manifest the love of God and man. And according to Gladys, Edgar Cayce's secretary, a powerful voice boomed through Edgar Cayce sleeping there on the couch, and she wrote it all in caps to make sure that people understood that this was something more powerful than she'd ever heard before. And the voice said, I am Michael, Lord of the way. Bend thy head, O you children of men. And so at once this other archangel showed up. And the voice suggested that enlightenment could come into the earth through the Cayce work, if those present were faithful. And so for the rest of Edgar Cayce's life, as I said, Michael showed up on a number of occasions. He had a strong affection for Morton Blumenthal, the guy who had more readings than anyone else, and showed up in a number of Morton's readings. In fact, on one occasion, Morton wanted to know what was the purpose of ARE. He asked that question again, and Michael responded, to give light to the people of the earth. And on another occasion, someone else asked Michael about the possibility of contacting their angel directly. They wanted to talk to the guardian angel. And the premise in the Edgar Cayce material is you should really shoot for the highest, shoot for the divine, shoot for Jesus if that's your path, but the highest. And then if angels can help you, they'll come in. But if you shoot for something lower than the highest, you may not always get the best result. Now, Michael was apparently irritated with the question. They asked, can we shoot for my angel directly? This is what Michael said. Bow thy heads, O you people that would seek to know the mysteries of life, when not applied in the manner has been laid down. O ye stiff-necked and adulterous generation. No, there is none that surpasses the Son of Man in his approach to human experience in the material world. In other words, shoot for the highest, and then the angels can come through. And the last message from Michael was just before Edgar Cayce's death. Cayce saw it as encouragement for those present to live up to the best within them. Michael said, there is today set before thee good and evil. Choose thou whom you will serve. Walk in the way of the Lord. The opportunity is before thee, accept or reject. So just as a quick overview, here's a summation of what everything Edgar Cayce said about angels, and then we'll move on to guides. Some angels are responsible for assisting in the soul growth of each and every one of us, and some have been doing it for a very long time. Without warning, on more than a dozen occasions, the Archangel Michael came through. And again, without warning, on more than a dozen occasions, the angel Hallel came through. Cayce's readings provide a few addendums to biblical stories about angels. The readings present a very unique perspective on fallen angels and evil, and some angels may be involved in their own path of growth and development. So let's move on to what Edgar Cayce had to say about guides. So a little humor, there's some charts on the wall here that suggest the company's not doing very well. One of the guys says, "I've got it. It's not incompetence. We've just been misled by our spirit guides." So, now some people don't know this, but Edgar Cayce had a spirit guide that appeared like an East Indian that showed up on 4 different occasions in his life that he made note of. Here's those 4 experiences. In 1910, early on, Mr. Cayce had been involved with a businessman and a doctor named Wesley Ketchum, who were really getting readings for him and underwriting his photography business. And unbeknownst to Mr. Cayce, Cayce was asleep on the couch, they were getting readings he didn't know about, like oil well readings and readings on horse races and things that he was not aware of what was going on. And on one occasion, Mr. Cayce was in his photography studio, and the East Indian walked up the stairs to the studio, walked into his office, looked Cayce in the face and told him, quote, you are in business with the wrong people," and disappeared. That was the first time he saw them. The second time, it was 1924, and he'd gone to New York to give readings. And he was at a friend's apartment, bless you. And there was a very attractive woman, actress in that apartment, who stayed there to listen to Cayce's story and said she wanted to hear more, and invited Cayce back to her apartment. So he went with her, and as soon as he walked in by himself with this young actress, he looked over in the corner of the room and saw the East Indian sitting there just watching him, probably over his eyes like this. And Cayce turned around and walked back out. That was the second time. The third time was in 1931. Edgar Cayce had lost the hospital, depressed to the depths of his soul. There was a group of ARE people who had been involved with Cayce's work and wanted him to start a new organization, the one that would become ARE. And they got up and gave testimonials about the work. And finally, when they decided to start the new organization, Cayce saw the East Indian in the room shaking his head and nod enthusiastically that that was in fact what they should do. And the final time was later that same year. He had been in New York, and he had been arrested for fortune telling in New York. He was let off. In fact, the judge actually became an ARE member. But he was still depressed. And he went out walking along a construction site, and he saw the East Indian approach him, walk over, fall down to his knees, take his hands in his hands, and start kind of like nodding to him. And it attracted a crowd, and the crowd came over, and as soon as the crowd got there, the East Indian was gone and was never seen again. So he had this guide that showed up on 4 occasions. In addition to that, Cayce suggested that all of us have guides in terms of deceased family members. That when someone dies, very often they remain concerned about us and they stay around to make sure we're going to be okay. And one of those guides was his mother for him. In 1934, this is just a few years after he had lost the hospital, he was still depressed about that. He was having problems with finances. He was still feeling ill from when he had pneumonia. A doctor recommended he go to the Southwest, so he went on a cross-country trip. And when he got there, he went to a field. And according to Edgar Cayce, his mother appeared to him. She'd been dead for 7 years and gave him a silver dollar, probably to encourage him about money. This is how he told a friend about it later. In March 1934, my mother came to me and talked with me, even though I was in New Mexico cattle pasture, and materialized a silver dollar to prove to me I should not worry about money, but to trust in God and do right, and the money for use would come. I took it as assurance, and it has proven so. Cayce also suggested that in our many incarnations, sometimes when our relatives aren't with us, they act as spirit guides on the other side. And perhaps the best example he gave was of these three people who work together very often. There's Mr. Cayce, Mrs. Cayce in the center, and his secretary Gladys on the right. And Cayce suggested that all of us, not only he, but all of us, have these soul groups that kind of come back together. That's why we like reruns. We're always coming back with the same people in various different roles. And that he seemed to give a pattern for people who had readings at his time that went like this. There was a group of souls that had spent time in Atlantis, time in Egypt, time in Palestine, time in Europe, time in colonial America, and time with Edgar Cayce. And almost all the people Edgar Cayce knew, his other sons, everybody, had had incarnations that fit that layout. Palestine at the time of Jesus. But the two exceptions were these two women were not told in any readings that they had been alive at the time of Jesus. And it kind of irritated them because everybody else had this special time at the time of Jesus and we're being left out. So they wanted to know why. So on one occasion, Gladys asked Mr. Cayce during a reading, "Did I have a lifetime at the time of Jesus?" And Cayce's simple response was no. Well, Gertrude decided to get more specific. So she asked this question in her reading. Question: what has caused the feeling of having had an experience at some time in Palestine? And Cayce responds, these two individuals, he's talking about Gertrude and Gladys, in their activity or vision over, became then what might be termed as guardian angels. In other words, the two of these were guardian angels for Edgar Cayce and Hugh Lynn Cayce, Edgar Cayce's son. See, these are the conditions. Study this that you may understand. The sojourn of a soul entity other than in materiality often influences or bears weight with individuals within the material plane. In other words, even when a soul is not in materiality, it can have an influence upon a soul that is. Such are termed or called by some guardian angels, or where influence that would promote activities for will or woe. Thus does the association of individuals at times become as an influence in the activities of individuals through particular periods or experiences. In other words, he's telling them that both of these women were spirit guides to Edgar Cayce and to his son when they had been alive at the time of Jesus. So we have relatives who sometimes can be spirit guides in other incarnations. They can also be spirit guides in the present. And one of the best examples of that is this woman who had been a bookkeeper and a secretary in her father's lumber business. And he had been a great businessman, built this big lumber empire in the South, and unfortunately he died of a heart attack. And the company had no one else in line for leadership. The rest of the executives were not as talented. The only other male in the family was a teenage boy. And so this woman who had been her father's bookkeeper and secretary went to Edgar Cayce for a reading and said, "What am I supposed to do?" And Edgar Cayce told her that her father was with her and that if she decided to keep the business, he would act as a spirit guide and help her make the right decisions until her brother was old enough to take over the business, if that's what she wanted. If she didn't want to be bothered with that, she could sell the business and he would go on for his other development. But the choice was hers to make. Did she want to keep the business and work with her father as spirit guide, or did she want to not have the hassle and let him move on to other realms of development? Cayce told her the decision must be made by self. Now, in terms of experiences with guides, I've had several experiences. I'll just tell you two. During my first marriage, I had an ongoing challenge with, it was with a stepchild, but I had an ongoing challenge. And there was one experience after another, and it was just very challenging for me. And I remember going outside, it was winter, I had a jacket on, and I go out to my car and I said aloud, because I was so frustrated, "God, what am I supposed to be learning from this?" And I heard a woman's voice as clear as could be in this left ear, and the woman said, and I quote, "How to have control of yourself when you have no control over the situation." And that helped. Just hearing that helped. So time passed. Eventually, I did get divorced. Time passed. And I had been divorced for a year, and I had no intention of getting remarried, at least at that period in my life. And I was at an ARE conference. At the time, I was manager of conferences. And they had hired a young woman to come and talk on intuition. And I didn't know who it was, really, but this woman walked in the back of the auditorium, and as soon as she walked by, I heard a woman's voice whisper in my ear, and I am not making this up, and I quote, "Tell that girl you think she's really cute." And I thought that was the worst pickup line I had ever heard. And I thought, I am not going to say that. And it repeated itself. "Tell that girl you think she..." And I said, I am not going to say that. And it ended up later on, this girl and I started talking, and we both liked movies. We ended up dating. Time passed. We ended up getting married. We've been together for 27 years. But eventually, yes, someone always asked me, did I tell her she was really cute? Yes, eventually I told her she was cute. But it was not during that first week at all, I can tell you. Now, of all the readings, one of the ones that is the most interesting in terms of guides is about a woman named Rose, whose mother had died. Her mother had died very young. And she had ongoing dream experiences with her mother. Cayce told her her mother was a spirit guide. Now, over 4 years, Rose and her mother, Lucille, had dozens, perhaps 50 communication experiences that are documented in the Cayce material. I'm only going to show you about a dozen of them, not all 50. But it's an ongoing story. The story is Rose and her husband, Edward, wanted to have a baby. They got pregnant. Halfway through the pregnancy, Rose had a miscarriage, depressed to the depths of her soul. And one night she has a dream. And her deceased mother came to her and told her that she was going to help her have a successful pregnancy. So Rose got a reading from Edgar Cayce and said, "What's this dream all about?" And Cayce told her, "Your mother's very much aware of what's going on in your life. She's going to help you have a successful pregnancy after this miscarriage." That was the first experience. So communication began. One day, Rose is asleep in her bed. And all at once she's awakened, and he sees her mother standing at the foot of her bed. And her mother says, "I am alive." And all at once she's gone, and Rose figures she's been asleep, so she gets a reading from Edgar Cayce. And Edgar Cayce tells her, "Your mother is very much alive. She's just in spirit form." So that was the second time. And time passed. And over again, Rose kept having communications. Eventually, Rose became pregnant. On another occasion, Rose had a dream. And in the dream, her mother came to her and told her that she was really concerned about her sister, not Rose's sister, but Lucille's sister, and afraid that she was in danger of getting in an automobile wreck that month, and she needed to warn her sister, her aunt, Rose's aunt. So Rose went to Edgar Cayce to get a reading. Now, at some point, I would have started just acting on my own, but every time, Rose gets a reading, every time. So Rose went to Edgar Cayce, and Cayce told her that the sister was in danger of getting in an automobile accident between now and the new moon, and to warn her about her driving. Another dream happened a month later. Lucille, the mother, came to her and told her that her other sister was in danger of getting pneumonia. Rose gets a reading. Cayce told her, "Your other sister is in danger of getting pneumonia and needs to take the proper precaution." This goes on and on and on. Meanwhile, Rose's husband, Edward, was at the deathbed of a family friend, an older person, and the family friend, unconscious there in the room, said, while they were dying, that Lucille came into the room to show them how to get to the other side. So Edward got a reading, and Cayce explained that Lucille had come to help the person get to the other side. In her 6 months of pregnancy, Rose has a severe cold. She's been to the doctor over and over again for help. Doctor is not helping her at all. And all at once, her mother appears to her in the dream and told her to beat an egg white with lemon and sugar and drink it. Rose did it, and her cough disappeared. All through the winter, she had additional dreams about her getting pregnant. And in her 8th month of pregnancy, there with a severe cold. Now, all at once, in April of 1927, Rose goes into labor. This is perhaps the most interesting one. And she was admitted to the hospital. She and Edward were very happy. They're about to have a baby. However, labor pains were much more severe than they had anticipated, and all at once, Rose was administered ether because she was in so much pain. According to Edward, this is the experience that happened next. As great an objective demonstration of spirit communication that I have ever seen or hoped to witness occurred this afternoon. He wrote this all down, sent it back to Cayce's office. Between Rose and her mother, as I was holding her hand. Hazily, she said to me, "My mother is with me." Remember, her mother's dead. "She's been with me since this morning. She is right there." Then Rose pointed to the other side of the bed from where I was sitting and indicating a little above her head and said, "My mother is right there." "What is she saying to you?" I asked. "She is telling me to be brave in my pain. She's bearing me up. I could never keep up my courage for her being with me. She is right here. She's been with me all day." "What is she saying?" I asked again. "She is saying," replied Rose clearly and precisely, "not to worry, that everything is coming out all right." "How do you know she's with you?" I asked. "I feel her. I see her. She's praying with me. She's right here, right here." And again, Rose pointed her hand in the same location. Now I ask you, have you ever heard of anything so wonderful? So Rose gave birth to a son. And later on, Rose had another dream. And in the dream, remember, Lucille had died, and then shortly thereafter, Rose's father, Lucille's husband, died. So both parents had died, which caused her other sister, Rose's sister, to become depressed. So Rose had a dream. Her mother came to her and told her her sister was depressed and was on the verge of committing suicide, and she needed to intervene. So she goes to Edgar Cayce, and Cayce tells her, yes, that she needs to be helped because she's on the verge of depression. Time passed, and she had another dream where she saw herself, her mother appeared to her and told her that the baby had a sour stomach, and she needed to give the baby milk of magnesia. Rose asked for advice from Edgar Cayce. He told her you needed to give the baby milk of magnesia. So, I mean, she just goes on and on and on. Another humorous one came where Lucille came to Rose in a dream. The mother came to the daughter. And during the conversation, the daughter says, "Do you ever see Father?" And Lucille answered, "Well, we're not on the same plane of existence." Now, I'm sure here women in the audience will decide whether she was a higher plane or a lower plane than her husband. Finally, in March 1930, Rose had her last reading from Edgar Cayce, and she asked whether or not she should try to keep up the ongoing communication with her mother. Cayce advised against it, telling her that it was not a good idea to try to maintain an ongoing communication with a guide, that they would come if they were needed. On another occasion, a woman wanted to know how she could get information from a guide. "I want to get information from my guide. How can I do it?" This is what Cayce told her. Not that, as a very crude example, one would send a plumber to judge a painting. One would not send a well digger to judge a musical interpretation. God's purpose is to glorify the individual man or soul in the earth. So the highest purpose of an individual soul or entity is to glorify the creative energy or God in the earth. Should the maker, shoot straight for the highest source, should the maker use a gnome, a fairy, an angel, a guide for a specific direction, he hath given his angels charge concerning thee. In other words, Cayce again is suggesting, shoot only for the highest, and when a guide is needed, it will be sent. So in terms of guides, here's what Cayce suggests. Each of us has guides who aim to assist us as part of their own growth and development. We draw to us guides who have an affinity with our own current level of spiritual development. In other words, sometimes a guide is no more spiritually developed than we are. The readings advise against contacting guides directly, but instead advise for seeking the presence of the divine. And oftentimes guides are actually relatives who continue to maintain a concern for loved ones. So let's talk a little bit about the afterlife. Now, just as a little humor, I'm not sure how many of you have this premise, but the idea is, during the day I don't believe in ghosts, but at night I'm a little more open-minded. Now, this is the earliest picture we actually have of Edgar Cayce. He's in the back row there. He was about 13 then, but when he was 4 years old, he actually used to see his deceased grandfather, who had fallen off a horse and broken his neck. So we know Edgar Cayce communicated with the deceased when he was young. But he also saw the deceased when he was older. When he was in Selma, Alabama, he had a photography studio. and he had hired a young woman named Bunchy to work for him. Her job was to retouch the color in some of the photographs. And unfortunately, Bunchy died as a young woman of a throat infection. 10 years pass. Edgar Cayce is in Virginia Beach, Virginia. He's in his bedroom at night asleep, and all at once he hears a knock on his window. He looks out the window, and he sees Bunchy floating outside his window. So he goes down and opens the front door, invites Bunchy in. She's dead, been dead for 10 years, and he asks what she's doing. And she explains to him that after she died, about 3 or 4 years later, the doctor who had been treating her throat died as well, and he'd been able to help her cure her throat infection on the other side. And then after that, she didn't know what she was supposed to be doing. And she had been looking for him ever since. That she'd gone back to the photography studio, he wasn't there anymore in Selma, and she'd hung around and eventually heard that he had actually moved to Virginia Beach, Virginia. So she went to Virginia Beach to find him, and that's what she found him because she figured he would tell her what she was supposed to be doing. And he said, well, did you ever see a light? Did you ever see a light? And she said she used to see a light, but she didn't see it anymore. And he told her to look for the light and that someone would come help her. And apparently it worked because she never showed up again. Now, as unusual as that may sound, especially for people who have no spiritual beliefs or no belief for an afterlife, there can be a long period when they don't really know what to do. On one occasion, Cayce told a group of people, death, as commonly spoken of, is passing through God's other door. There's continued consciousness. Many an individual has remained in that called death for what you call years without realizing it was dead. Just imagine that. Now, probably a number of you have heard about the near-death experience. One of the individuals who started the interest in the near-death experience was Dr. George Ritchie. He wrote a book called Return from Tomorrow. And when he was at the University of Virginia, he told his story to a young medical student named Raymond Moody, who eventually started taking down stories of what happens, life after life. But it was really George Ritchie who had that experience that inspired Raymond. And George was in his 70s at this point, 60s, 70s. When George was 20, he died. He died at basic training for World War II down in a military base in Texas. He died of pneumonia. And according to George, his experience was he was left on a gurney in the morgue, and Jesus came and got him and took him on a tour of consciousness. And he took him all over to show him how ghosts and different beings have experiences of consciousness on the other side. And believe it or not, one of the places he took George was a bar. And he took George up to a bar to show him that when people die, they maintain their same addictions. So that if you were an alcoholic when you were alive, you're an alcoholic when you're dead. You just can't drink. And this is what George saw when they were in the bar. Then I noticed a striking thing. A number of the deceased men standing at the bar seemed unable to lift their drinks to their lips. Over and over I watched them clutch at their shot glasses, hands passing through the solid tumblers, through the heavy wooden countertop, through the very arms and bodies of the living drinkers around them. And it was obvious that these living people, the ones actually drinking, talking, jostling each other, could neither see the desperately thirsty disembodied beings among them, nor feel their frantic pushing to get to those glasses. Suddenly I was staring in amazement as the bright cocoon around the unconscious living sailor opened up. It parted at the very crown of his head and began peeling away from his head, his shoulders. One of the non-solid deceased people vanished in as he hurled himself at the opening inside the other man in order to feel what it felt like to be drunk. That was his experience. Now, Hughlin Cayce used to tell this story. John and I were lucky enough to hear Hughlin lecture. He was like the most popular lecturer when we were young. And he used to tell the story of a ghost in his house, and the ghost was his grandfather. And this is how he told the story. My grandfather lived with us in Virginia Beach. While visiting my father's sister in Hopkinsville, he died. About 3 days after the funeral, my grandfather showed up again in Virginia Beach. Now, he was dead. We couldn't see him, but we could hear him. He had asthma. We could hear him breathing. Everybody in the house could hear him. It was weird, but Dad, Edgar Cayce, insisted that he was just straightening out his papers and that he was going on very soon. He hadn't planned on dying. He'd come back to straighten things up. Whenever I heard the noise in my grandfather's room, I kept running up the stairs. Dad kept telling me to leave him alone. He'd go in a little bit. One day the postman came to the door. He knew my grandfather. The two used to chat. I dragged him inside the front hallway and asked him to listen. Upstairs you could hear my grandfather moving in the room, things shuffling, the floorboards creaking. The postman said, "What in the world is that?" I said, "It's my grandfather." His eyes opened wide and he said, "I thought your grandfather was dead." I assured him, "He is." He turned as white as a sheet and from then on delivered the mail in the box out at the gate. So there's a continuity of consciousness after we die. Whatever we're concerned with, we're still concerned with. Whatever we're worried about, we're still worried about. Whoever we love, we still love. On one occasion, the readings could put kind of a humorous twist on this. For do not consider for a moment, for this might be carried on to an indefinite end, that an individual soul entity passing from the earth plane as a Catholic, a Methodist, an Episcopalian is something else because he is dead. He's only a dead Episcopalian, Catholic, or Methodist. So we take our belief systems with us. Now, I mentioned early on, I showed you the slide of what Edgar Cayce saw when he traveled through different levels of experience. This is how Edgar Cayce described that experience. I see myself as a tiny dot out of my physical body, which lies inert before me. I find myself oppressed by darkness, and there's a feeling of terrific loneliness. Suddenly, I'm conscious of a white beam of light. As this tiny dot, I move upward, following the light, knowing that I must follow it or be lost. As I move along this path of light, I gradually become conscious of various levels upon which there's movement. Upon the first levels, there's vague, horrible shapes, grotesque forms such as one sees in nightmares. Passing on, there begin to appear on either side misshapen forms of human beings, with some part of the body magnified. Again, there's a change, and I become conscious of gray-hooded forms moving downward. Gradually, these become lighter in color. Then the direction changes, and these forms move upward, and the color of the robes grow rapidly lighter. Next, there begin to appear on either side vague outlines of houses, walls, trees, etc., but everything is motionless. As I pass on, there's more light and movement in what appear to be normal cities and towns. With the growth of movement, I become conscious of sounds, at first indistinct rumblings, then music, laughter, and the singing of birds. There's more and more light. The colors become very beautiful, and there's the sound of wonderful music. The houses are left behind. Ahead, there's only the blending of sound and color. Quite suddenly, I come upon a hall of records. It's a hall without walls, without ceiling, but I'm conscious of seeing an old man who hands me a large book, a record of the individual for whom I seek the information. Now, the reason I showed you that is Cayce is suggesting that there are levels of consciousness growth on the other side. And when we pass on, whatever level we're at, from what we've done on this side, that's where we end up. That's why Rose and her husband were not necessarily at the same level. Because whatever we do here, we take with us there. We're no smarter, we're no more enlightened, we're no more spiritual than we were here. So wherever you are here, that's what you're going to pick up later on when you get there. It's an ongoing growth and experience until actually we've essentially reached perfection, eventually. So over the years, I've had several experiences with ghosts. The first one happened when I was 12 or 13. And I remember I was in my bedroom, and my brother and I shared a bedroom together. We had our own beds, but in a bedroom, and we were right next to my parents' room. And lots of times, if we were up too late, they'd come in and tell us to shut up or whatever it was. So our bedrooms were right next to theirs. And I was 12 or 13, and one night, all at once, in the middle of the night, I heard a really deep woman's voice yell really loud at me, "I'm dead." That loud. "I'm dead." And it was scary for a 12-year-old, and I jumped out of bed. I said, "What?" And my mother heard, and she ran into the room, and she said, "What's wrong?" I said, "Some lady," and I was innocent and naive, I said, "Some lady just told me she was dead." Now, my mother was kind of horrified that I may be a little crazy, and I know that because that day when I was at school, she went to church, and she got some holy water, and she came and she told me later that she had sprinkled my bed with holy water while I'd been at school, thinking somehow I'd seen a demon. Well, later on that night, we're sitting down for dinner, and at dinner, the phone rang, and it was a friend of my mother's calling, and one of the ladies she had played bridge with for years had died the night before. Now, I felt like that woman had come to tell my mother that she had died. But somehow I heard it. And I really wanted to have a conversation about this experience because I thought there was something interesting here, but nobody wanted to talk about it. My mother did not want to talk about it. So that was the first time. The next time, here's a picture of my grandparents. They lived in North Ogden, Utah. My grandmother Mary, my grandfather Pingree. I used to visit them every summer for at least a week. If you can imagine the most perfect grandparents who loved you unconditionally, these two had it down pat. I used to say, when my parents weren't around, I wished I could just go live with them because they were perfect. Well, we used to spend lots of holidays with them, especially Thanksgiving. We'd drive over from Colorado to Utah. We spent almost every Thanksgiving with them. Eventually, my grandfather died in 1989. And shortly thereafter, I had this dream. And in the dream, we're at my grandparents' house for Thanksgiving. And we're all sitting around the Thanksgiving table like we had so many times before. All our family, my mother, my father, my mother's brother, their family. So there was probably 17 of us. And I looked into the kitchen, and all by himself was my grandfather standing there. So I got up from the table, and I went in to talk to my grandfather, and he told me he was dead, and he told me he was fine, and he thanked me for having the opportunity to be his grandfather. And we had a very great experience. He told me everything was fine. I had that dream over and over and over and over and over. And one day I said, why do I keep having this dream? And then it hit me. My grandfather was trying to communicate that information to everyone around the Thanksgiving table. But I was the only one watching my dreams. He was trying to reassure everyone he was okay. And Cayce says over and over and over again that very often, our loved ones will try to communicate it to us in our dreams. Years passed, just to give you an example, I used to answer a lot of the calls that came into ARE, and a woman called in once that her daughter had died. 3-year-old daughter had been out by the street, and a mail truck or something gone around the corner, run over her. Her name was Stacy, and she died. And her minister told her to call us. And she called me, and she was just distraught. And I said, well, why don't you write out the question, how's Stacy? Watch your dreams and see what happens. She called me back a few days later. She said, I have a dream, but it doesn't make sense. I said, what's the dream? She says, you went out to the grave site, and on her daughter's grave, her daughter was sitting there with a birthday cake and candle, the candle lit, and she looked up at her mom and said, don't worry, Mommy, I'm okay, I'm okay, I'm okay. And the woman says, but she's not okay, she's dead. And I said, she's very much alive. She's just not physical. And so our deceased loved ones can communicate with us from the other side. Now, the best ghost story that I have surprised the heck out of me. But this is the true story. I met a woman named Angela Marsh Peterson in 1996, and we became fast friends. And she hooked on to me because she knew about Edgar Cayce and ARE, and she wanted me to write her life story. And the reason she had an interesting life story is anything that could happen to a woman in the 20th century happened to her. She'd been married and divorced. She lost a child to death. She'd been raped. She started her own business. She'd lived overseas. She'd been a fraternity mother at a boys' fraternity. She started the largest doll museum in this country, founded by a woman. I mean, just an incredible life story. This is how I met Angela right here. She was always in this wheelchair. And just to give you an idea of Angela's personality, she was a little crotchety because her body was shot. She's in this wheelchair, but her mind was completely fit. And in her nursing home, most of the other people were the opposite. They could still walk around, but their mind was not always there. And Angela was very frustrated with that. And she was frustrated she used to tell me, no matter how many times you ring that buzzer, nobody comes. So I called her one day. I used to call her twice a week, and I'd go down and visit her once a month while we were working on this life story. And I called her one day, and I say, Angela, how was your day? She used to call me honey. She said, honey, I had the worst day. I said, why, Angela, what happened? She said, they didn't bring me my lunch tray. And I rang that bell, and I rang that bell, and and nobody came. I said, well, what'd you do? When they finally came, she said, I told them, I may not like the food, and I may complain about it, but by God, I want the satisfaction of throwing it out. So she had this kind of personality. And the one thing that she had been married to this guy named Fred Peterson for 20 years. They were married between 1925 and 1945. And she never cared for Fred Peterson. In fact, when she talked about him, she called him Mr. Peterson. Not Fred, Mr. Peterson. Well, Mr. Peterson had died in the 1960s. And here, this is 30 years later, Angela is still alive. So she didn't really care for Mr. Peterson. And one day I called her, and I said, Angela, how are you doing? She said, honey, you're never going to believe who was in my room today. I said, who was in your room? She said, Mr. Peterson was at the foot of my bed. And I figured he's coming to get her, to help her go to the other side. So I said, well, Angela, how did you feel about that? She said, well, I did think to myself, you were married for 20 years. She said, and then I thought, well, he is the husband, the father of your 2 children. She said, and then I thought, if they want me to go, there's no way I'm going with Mr. Peterson. They're going to have to send somebody else. So she lasted about 6 weeks later, and she died. And Angela and I had worked together for 4.5 years, and Angela read all but the last 30 pages of the manuscript before it was published. So that's the story. Eventually it was published as this book, One Woman's Century, by a North Carolina publisher. It's an amazing story. Anyway, time passes, a year. And I'm in New York with a friend of mine. His name was Keith, he and his wife, Keith and Eileen. Keith is dying of liver cancer. And he didn't drink and he didn't smoke. So I drove he and Eileen up to the Sloan Kettering Hospital in New York to see if there was someone there that could help him. There wasn't. But we had gone out, Keith, Eileen, and I. They were in one bed and I was in another in the same hotel room because it's so expensive in New York. We'd gone out one night for a play and came back, and I was still kind of keyed up from the play. And Eileen and Keith were asleep, and all at once as I'm sitting in bed, Angela walked through the door. And it wasn't this Angela sitting in the chair, it was her, but she was walking. And she walked right through the door, and the only way I can describe her, it was like seeing someone studded with diamonds. Her whole body was just exuding light, just light all over. And she walked over to the bed, and she leaned down, and she said, thank you for finishing the book, honey. And she kissed me on the cheek, and as soon as she kissed me, I swear to you, it was like being electrocuted. It was like I could feel electricity go all through my body, and she was gone. But that is the best ghost story that I have, somehow seeing Angela. So, what did Edgar Cayce say about the afterlife? There's a continuity of consciousness from life to death. It's just walking through God's other door. In other words, you are who you are. But just because you're dead doesn't mean you're any wiser. Whatever concerns, desires, habits we had while alive remain with us for a time. It's also very possible for us to communicate with the deceased and vice versa. And there are levels of consciousness corresponding with our own growth and development on the other side. Now, I'd like to close and suggest that we have an app that we created this year that is actually free, that I would recommend every one of you get if you want. If you just go to your app store, whether it's Android or Apple, it's called the Edgar Cayce Co-Creation app. And basically, it'll give you a thought for the day once a week that you can work with. I don't know if this will play. We'll see if it'll work here. Let me see if...
Ideal number 3.
I don't know if you can hear that.
Purpose today. Life is a purposeful experience. And there is a reason that we have been drawn to this particular experience and these particular individuals at this particular time in life. As a means of discovering what we should do just now, repeat 3 times every day and then listen. Lord, what would you have me do today? Lord, what would you have me do today?
Where's
Lord,
your headphone jack?
I don't know.
What would you have me do today?
That's all right.
Don't say this only as repetition. Say it.
There is this app that you can have for free once a week. If you want to listen to it every day, you have to pay for it. But I went through and I took out all the these and thous and ye's and yays, and I actually listen to it on the way to work every day. And it's a great way to take the Edgar Cayce material with you and feel inspired throughout the course of the day. I want to thank you all for being a part of my evening this evening. And if you want to talk more, I'll be back at the book table. Thank you all for being here.